So we left it off with intents, right? So intents is, again, something that's new to Android. It's essentially an event or an action that we are creating. So an intent is how you start an activity, how you start a service, stop a service, send a broadcast. Any of those sorts of things are intents. So let me sort of give you an example of how you would use intents from a user standpoint, just to kind of give you an idea what it is. So this is a typical, what we call a task, right? So I open up my Gmail. So by the way, these boxes correspond to applications. So this is one app, this is another app, this is another app. They're totally separate. They're actual separate Linux processes and so forth. So I open up my Gmail application, and I am now viewing a list of my email messages that I have, right? So this is my activity. This is one activity that I have. Again, an application can have multiple activities, right? Just like a website can have multiple pages. It's something people usually confuse, those two things, the activities and applications. So I have one activity called message list, just a list of my messages, right? And I see you sent me a message. So I say, great, I want to view that message. I click on it. That click generates an intent, right? That says, open up this message. So that gets handled by another activity that's also part of this application Gmail, right? But it's a different type of activity. It's an activity that actually displays the message, right? So I can now view the message. So this was the intent that I made from one activity to another within the same app, right? Now I see in the message you said, oh, check out this great link, right? So I do that. I click on the link, generating another intent, which now pops up a web browser, a totally different application, in a totally different memory space, right? Within that new application, we open up a new activity called view of web page activity, right? So now I flip-flop to a third screen where I'm viewing that web page, right? And in that web page, there's a link that says, hey, look, there's a great video that explains this thing, right? So I click on that, and that now creates another intent and opens up YouTube to view the video. So what I did is I basically created one intent, another intent, and another intent, right? To basically jump from screen to screen to screen to screen, right? 4 screens in total across multiple applications. Does that make sense? So that's essentially what an intent is. It's a construct. It's a very high-level messaging construct that says, let something happen. Start an activity, for instance. There's only a couple of ways you can send an intent. It's sort of, you can say, start an activity, or stop a service, or send a broadcast. That's about it, right? There's a couple of approaches like that. Now, a couple of things, some things that are interesting about intents is that they can be implicit or explicit, and I think this is sort of an important thing here. So, an implicit intent is when you spell out who you want to handle this. You say, I want such and such class, like a Java class, to handle this action, right? And that's the case what I did here. So Gmail, when I said view a message, Gmail said this is the specific internal class that's capable of viewing a message. So start this internal class, right? So we were quite implicit in that case. Sorry, we were quite explicit in that case, right? Spelling out what we wanna, how we wanna handle that, right? Now, when I said open up a web page, right? This is more of an implicit intent. We're basically saying, here's an action that requires viewing a web page. Anybody who's capable of doing that is fair game, right? So basically, multiple apps get to vote and say, I can do that, right? So this, in turn, means that a user can replace any application on the device. And this is something that's sort of new to Android and interesting to Android as opposed to iPhone or any other ecosystem. So on Android, the user can replace pretty much any part of the system quite easily, right? So all these things are sort of loosely coupled, and that makes it very powerful from users' point of view, right? And it's very unique on Android. In other words, you've heard the buzzword, all apps are created equal, right? So, so this is sort of equivalent to, does anybody still use Internet Explorer? So, if you use Windows, you get Internet Explorer, right? That's your default browser, right? But then at some point you say, I want to download another browser. So you download Firefox, Chrome, Safari, whatever that is, right? And then what happens is the system says, okay, you're not your default browser. Would you like me to be, right? So at that point, Firefox or Safari or Chrome become your default browser. It works exactly the same way on Android. So let me just kind of show you. There's an application that ships with the SDK. It's part of the samples, and it's actually a replacement home application. You know, so see this application here. That's actually a that's actually a home application. Let me just see why it's not opening it. Let me do this. I'm going to delete this one. For some reason, it's not seeing it. So I'm going to add it from samples. So if you have samples installed, you can do new Android project. And you can say, I want to choose a project. Oh, you got to pick a target. So 2.2. You say, I want to choose a project from samples. And I'm going to choose the home, right? And you just click on finish. Let me just close all this because it's not relevant. So at this point, I have a home application. And I'm going to run it. Again, it's the replacement for this. This is the home app, right? So it's starting, it's installing it. Notice when it goes black, by the way, hold on 1 second, it just takes some time. We can, oh, sorry, home is installed, right? It doesn't run. It's not a type of application that you press on to run. It's a different type of application. It gets started by this little button here, right? So there's a different type of intent that starts home, right? So let me show you this. So I'm going to press on this thing here, and since now I have multiple possible homes, in other words, I have multiple possible handlers for an event or intent, the system is saying, which one would you like to handle this, right? So there's my built-in home. That's the one that comes with default Android, open source version Android. And this is the sample home, right? So this is the equivalent of you downloading Firefox for the first time and saying, I'm not your default browser. So I'm going to click on home to show you the sample home. But at the same time, check out how long it's going to take to start. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, about 8 seconds. Right, 8-9 seconds. I don't know why it's not resizing properly, but that's a different story. So this is a different home screen, home app, right? I can go and find my apps and that sort of stuff, right? And by the way, so that's how long it took to start first time. Let's say now we go to Yamba, for instance. Let's say I want to go back to home. Check out how long it's going to take now to start. 1, 2. It's much quicker, right? Right, that's because second time around we came from here back into running as opposed to stop running, doing all this again, right? That's sort of a visible example how caching stuff in stop state actually makes things run faster. Okay, so that's the so in terms of the intents, that's how you that's the difference between explicit intents and implicit intents, right? And that's how intents basically create a task. And that's one of the building blocks that we have available to us. Any questions on intents? So how manipulatable are intents? So intents are simply the thing that you can do to intents is you can attach a certain amount of data. So you can attach a little bit of data, but that data is sort of very primitive. So primitive name-value pairs. I kind of compare intents to a URL, like when you say $ID equals 47 in a URL. So yes, you can pass some data, but not a lot and not very structured, other than name-value pairs. So it's not really designed for a workflow per se, right? It's more of an intent, an action that you would like to happen. So it's not so much for scripting sort of steps, yeah.
So it's not a good way of getting data back from some other.
It's not. Yeah, it's not a good. No, yeah, exactly. So, well, we're gonna see a couple of other building blocks that you have at your disposal that are better for sharing data. Intents are not designed for that. Another thing that I kind of wanted to point out, not that it matters at this stage of our conversation, but intents are asynchronous. If you ever look at making remote procedure calls, RPCs, or IPC, inter-process communication, using AIDL, which is sort of more, I'm going to talk about that tomorrow, but that's sort of more of an advanced topic, how you do this process-to-process communication across the boundaries, but you're doing it synchronously. In other words, I'm making a call and I'm waiting until that thing happens, right? They say, do something, and I'm not moving on until you get your job done, and then I get the result and move on. So that's more of a blocking or synchronous call. This is asynchronous. So it's really fast. You just say, let something happen. And then, the caller keeps on moving on, does its job, and then at some point that something happens because it's left somewhere to be done. There's a queue and a looper that processes that.
So the caller has to keep track of all the intents he has done and how many succeeded and how many failed.
Yes, yeah. So actually, there's something called a looper. Each thread has a looper, and the looper picks things from a queue. So there's a queue of these messages. So that's how it happens internally. So any other questions on intents? Yeah. So the next thing that we have is services. This is another one of those Droid does from the commercial, as opposed to iPhone doesn't. So you can have background services. So you can have things that are running in the background, right? Essentially, a service is just like an activity. It just doesn't have any UI. You can't see it, right? It's some work that keeps happening in the background. One example of a service that I kind of have that's kind of visual and people can relate to would be a music player. So if I have a music player app, so this entire thing is my application, right? So if I have an application like this, of course I need some kind of user interface. So I need to be able to pick a song, press play, press next, see the cover art, all that kind of stuff, right? But I also don't want to own the playing of the music from the activity itself, because the activity could be wiped out at any point in time, right? If system needs more memory and this is in the background, it's going to get destroyed. So what I would like to do is I would like to own the playing of the music from within a service. So a service is going to be started, it's going to be running in the background, and it's going to have a mind of its own. It's going to keep on running. This guy can get wiped out, gone, destroyed, no longer in memory. This guy keeps on running, right? Now, when I say this guy is gone from memory, I don't mean the application is destroyed. I mean the activity is destroyed. So the activity object is gone. The application instance is still running. So it kind of, people get confused about that, but application is sort of like a placeholder for all these different components that we can throw into it. And they're kind of loosely coupled within. So as long as you have at least one of these components still inside of the app is going to be around. In other words, the Linux process, the virtual machine, they're going to be around. Yeah.
Just to clarify for me, an activity is equivalent to UI view in iPhone, for the most part?
Activity is equivalent to UI view. I'm not sure about iPhone, so okay. Yeah. But roughly, I mean, from visibly, so I'm gonna turn this off. I'm gonna say don't ask me again and use the standard. But so this is an activity. If I go start my Yamba, this is an activity, right? If I go to preferences, this is an activity. So every single screen is an activity. So back to services. So service is basically just something that runs in the background. Service has a different life cycle than a activity, and it's much less managed by the system. So essentially, service is starting, so it runs through onCreate, onStart, and then it's in what we call the running state, right? And that means services are alive, it's doing something in the background until you say stop service and you destroy it. So the key here is that you as a developer, you get to send an intent saying start a service, stop a service. Unlike activity, there's no stop an activity, right? With a service, you can actually start it, you can actually stop it. So you have a little bit more of a control over that. And the system is going to interfere a little less with services. The assumption is that the services are more of a lightweight things, right? Because they do not require UI, so presumably they don't do a lot. Now, granted, that doesn't mean that it's going to stop you from, downloading a whole bunch of data or listening to GPS or anything expensive like that from within a service as well. You can, so you can write bad code, but the assumption is that the service does not have to have anything massively expensive running in the background. Okay. So far, I've been talking about unbound services. These are the services that have the mind of its own. There's also a concept called a bound service when something binds to a service remotely. That's what I'm going to talk about tomorrow. That's AIDL or IPC mechanism, so inter-process communication. It's a different ballgame altogether. So the easiest one of them is the unbound services, and that's what we've been talking about. Yeah. So if the service is already running and you start a second service to run it again, does it start a separate thread altogether? It doesn't. If the service is already running, the service is starting an already running service is going to do nothing. So in other words, let me rephrase that. Service, there's two methods. There's on create and on start. It's actually on start command, but on start has been deprecated, they renamed it. But basically, if the service doesn't exist at all in memory, on create runs, number one, right? If the service in on start runs subsequently, and then we say the service is in a running state. Now, if you say start a service that's already started, then on create is not going to run, but on start will. So in other words, if you wanted to do something every time it started, you can, but you don't have to. But it's not going to create a separate thread. It's not going to create another object or anything like that. It's the same object. It's a singleton essentially for a service. And another key thing that we're gonna be talking about this later on, but a service is actually running inside of a same thread as the UI. So everything runs by default on the same thread, which has its own implications, right? So in other words, if you're doing, like, for example, one example of a service is going to be I'm pulling data from a network periodically. Like I'm going to Twitter to see if I got new tweets. Well, the network could be slow or is slow, right? So that means that blocking on a network call may take 2, 3, 5, 10 seconds, 30 seconds. Timeout never happen, right? And during that time, our UI is not going to be responsive. So the user is not going to be able to do anything for half a minute while waiting for the network. Really bad design, right? That's where you get application not responding ANR errors, which we're going to talk about. Yeah. Yes, you can create a separate thread, and there are multiple ways of doing that as well. So we'll talk about that. Yeah. Go ahead.
So I assume service can destroy itself after it's done?
Service can, yes, service can just be done with what it's doing. Another thing that I wanted to just point out, that's a good point. The fact that we say running here, it doesn't mean that it's really doing a lot. It could be just loaded in memory and sitting idle, very low on resources, right? Similarly, in activity, the fact that I said this is a stop state, in other words, it's not visible, the activity is not visible, doesn't mean that it's not doing anything. Similarly, the fact that it is visible doesn't mean that it is doing anything. It could be sitting idle and waiting for user input, right? Consequently, it could be not visible but actually doing a lot, listening to GPS, downloading data, and so on, doing processing expensive stuff. So be mindful of that. In ideal world, you're not doing expensive stuff when not in a background and so on. Sorry, you had a question.
So if an activity starts a service and then Android keeps the activity and the activity comes back again, what happens to the service?
If activity starts a service, activity goes away, right? And the service is still going to be running. That's the case of the music player. So this guy is disposable. It's just our UI, but we don't want the music to stop playing.
Right, but is there a case where when the activity comes back, it can actually go back and have that service?
Yeah, the service is a singleton. So if this guy comes back again, so now it's alive, and it says stop or start service, it's talking to the very same service.
So the work is not redone. It actually uses
Yeah,
more.
exactly. It uses the same service. Yes. Question in the back. Yes. So if you send an intent to a service, yes, so it receives the intent via one of the lifecycle methods, such as onStart or specifically onStart command. So just like a activity, a service has onStart, onStop, those sorts of methods, and the onStart command takes the intent as the incoming. So you know the intent. You can easily get the intent that started it. Yeah. So you can get the data, and then you can get extras from that. So far, everyone good on services? So this was the example of an unbound service, a service that has a mind of its own. This would be an example of a bound service, which we're going to talk about. I'm going to talk about tomorrow in the internals presentation. But so this is where we are using something called a binder, and we're using something called AIDL to make something called interprocess IPC call from one process to another, right? And that's how a lot of system services work. So, for example, location manager, sensor manager, Wi-Fi manager, telephony manager, Bluetooth manager, connectivity manager, network manager. All these managers, i.e., system services, work that way. Okay. But so that's a different ball game. So we're going to talk about it tomorrow. Today we're going to talk about this unbound service. We'll see an example of that. So moving on, the next thing the next component, the next building block that we have is something called a content provider. Yeah, question? So in case you have an application that only has activities, once the process is once the last activity is destroyed, the application gets destroyed as well. That's correct. Yes. That's correct. So so if I have again, if the concept of an application, so this is the application. So even though the activity is gone, as long as this guy is still alive, the application needs to exist. We need the Linux process, we need a Dalvik virtual machine in order to run this. So the question is basically what about memory and all that. So the system tends to manage services a little less, right? Because it considers considers the service to be more of a lightweight component. The user can actually manage services by going into menu, so basically settings application, and you can go into your applications setting, and you can see the running services. And so the user can actually kill the services. So you can see that I currently have Yamba service running. It's consuming 5.9 megs of RAM. And if I don't like it, I can click on, destroy it and destroy it. So is this actually services? Yeah. So yes. So see, there's a process with one process, one service running currently. Yes. Yeah. So the process. So everything runs inside of the same process. I think sort of application as sort of like a pizza, right? So you have your pizza dough, right? And then activities, services, providers, receivers, all these main building blocks are just toppings on top of it, right? So you need a pizza to be able to put a topping on top of it. So as long as you have at least one topping, you require the dough, right? So that's sort of, so even though this guy is gone, as long as this guy is around, we need the dough to hold it together. We need a process, yeah.
So if the user does go in and terminate the service, does that call stop service?
Yes, yeah. It should gracefully terminate it. Yes. So it's gone from here, and later on we'll see it in the log, but we can actually monitor this. We can see what's going on. Yeah. Any other questions on that? Yeah.
The system gets low on memory and wants to kill your activities, you may never get them undestroyed. Are there similar situations where you destroyed for your service?
It is possible, yes. So you can, yeah, it's,
Just go away and never know why.
it is possible that the service gets destroyed without onDestroy ever being called, yes. Yeah, we simulate that. I can kill -9 the process, right? Just blow it away, and you know, yeah, that's totally fine. So, and there's actually on terminate in the application, which is there, but for some reason is documented that it never gets called. So there's this great method that just is never being called for some reason. Yeah. It is would not calling onDestroy basically leave the memory leaks. It's possible. I mean, eventually the garbage collector is going to clean all that stuff up. I'm not so concerned about memory leaks as much as leaving resources open, such as the database connection. So those are more of a concerns. But yeah. So moving on to content providers. So this is another main building block. And basically what a content provider is a component that is available to you to share the data. So like we said earlier that intents are not a good way to share data, right? They're more of a here's an action type of thing. Content providers are more for sharing data. And they're basically an interface. Okay, that's one way to think about it. It's just basically an interface that provides your basic CRUD functionality, create, retrieve, update, and delete, right? Or more specifically, insert, update, delete, and query, right? So the way I kind of draw it like this, so you can kind of see how it pierces. So if this is the process sandbox, right? This is our process sandbox, our application. We are piercing that process sandbox by exposing these 4 APIs, insert, update, delete, and query, right? And essentially that usually just proxies down to the database. So typically you would back your content provider with a database, but that by no means that's the only way to do it, right? Your data source could be anything. It could be the cloud or file system or whatever. But content provider is basically a way to share data across applications. The system itself uses content providers quite a bit. Examples of that would be contacts, right? Media store, settings, and so on. So let me just show you an example first, and then it may make a little more sense why we have it. So here I have 2 applications, and this is actually a real scenario. This is how your Android phone behaves right now. We have 2 apps. We have one app, which is the Contacts app. This is the one you guys see. When you go and look at your Contacts application, this is the one you actually see. And it's called Contacts. It's got one activity. It's got multiple activities, but let's, for simplification purposes, it's got an activity to manage contacts. This is the UI. But it's got no data. This app has 0 data. It does not actually have a database whatsoever. Now, on the other hand, there's a totally different application called Contacts Provider, right? It's a separate app in a separate process with a separate Linux ID, everything totally separate. And it has all the data, but it has no UI, okay? So it's exposing its data via those 4 insert, update, delete, and query to anyone else, right? So what we're essentially doing here is we're loosely coupling or decoupling these 2 apps. As opposed to having one Contacts app with everything, we're separating this into the UI and the data. Yeah. It's not a service. Content provider is a content provider, right? It's confusing with a service because it's not visible, right? And I often get this. So and you guys are going to see. So not all the components are visible, right? Content provider is invisible process, right? But it's used for sharing data. Service is also an invisible process, but it's used for running some kind of code, right? It's more of a go pull tweets every once in a while. Go pull tweets every once in a while, right? That's a service. Content provider is insert tweet, query tweets, right? It's more of a data sharing mechanism as opposed to running process mechanism. But they're both invisible components that happen to sit somewhere in memory in the background. Yeah. content provider app, does that mean it's always running? It's actually, it doesn't mean that it's always running, but it's going to be running when it's needed. So it's going to pop up, the process is going to get created, it's going to serve its purpose, and at some point it's going to get destroyed. That's also done magically, and we don't really need to worry about it too much. Yes, I'm going to actually, what we're going to do, so I'm keeping this super simple lines and circles, concepts, right? Get you guys to understand concepts. Then I'm going to show you how to assemble these concepts into an app, the Yamba app, right? We're going to actually walk through the diagrams, how to do this. Then I'm going to show you the code, right? But just, showing you the code is just going to kind of like, it's going to confuse you with just intricacies of code. You guys know Java. That's not my concern, right? You know that, that's easy. I'm trying to kind of get the lines and circles clear first, and then but we will get to the code. We're kind of doing very much top-down sort of approach. Okay. So the main thing here is that these are two separate concepts, apps with a Chinese wall between them, with only 4 little holes poked in that wall for insert, update, delete, and query. Okay, and we're loosely coupling components this way so that they can get recombined in multiple different ways, right? So that is content provider. Yeah. So the calls themselves are synchronous here. So it's get me the data and I'm waiting for the data to come back. Right? It's synchronous because it doesn't typically, and I think you have 10 seconds to perform before ANR pops up, application not responding. But typically it's a faster call. It is synchronous, and this sort of thing, as I said, is used in the system a lot. So, for example, if you guys have like an HTC phone, right? You probably have Sense UI on top of it, right? So, as opposed to using the standard Android contacts app, it's got a much sexier address book, right? The reason why it's possible to do something like that is because they basically just replaced this. They replaced Contacts app, but it's tapping into the same data source. So you can have multiple address books. They're going to have the same data, right? Or if you download the Facebook app, or if you download the Twitter app, it's going to tap into existing contacts. So you're mishmashing all these different data sources to create this like rich sort of environment. For example, I may take a photo with my camera. Well, that doesn't go into the camera data. It goes into the media store, so that my wallpaper is aware of that, so that my Gmail can upload it and share it, so that my Facebook can also share it and so on. So that's an example of that, yeah. So the question is what kind of a call this is. I'm not sure if this, it is an inner process call, but I don't think it's handled the same way as standard IPC AIDL call is handled. So I'm not sure exactly how that's handled. These two apps don't have to be related whatsoever. I'll show you actually, we're going to delve into the file system, and I'll show you how on the file system this relates. They're totally different from each other and so on. Now, apps do have a way to control permissions. So I may say, look, I'm only going to expose to guys who have a certain permission and so on, right? But the protocol is open, right? Just like the protocol for me to access, for example, Bank of America website is open, it's HTTP. But the fact that Bank of America is going to serve me data or not is really up to the business logic that's implemented on their end. So in other words, we can control the access through some business logic via permissions if we choose to, but the protocol itself is fairly open, yeah. Is there such a to query for? So the question is about querying for content providers. There isn't really a way to do that. You access content providers via content resolver. So you can think of a resolver as a sort of something that resolves it, but you basically pass a URI to a resolver. Yeah, and those are published for all the system ones, and then you can create your own. Okay, we have Can you from one content provider call another content provider? Absolutely, yes. So this content provider, now it says, okay, you're calling my query method, right? So where am I going to get the data? Well, it could be as simple as, go to the database, right? In which case this call becomes almost a one-liner proxy, if that's how you choose to implement it. Or it could be, there's a cloud and I'm going to do some fancy logic and go to the cloud and get that. So in other words, do a network call. Or I could do another, go to another content provider and so on. So that's how, like on Android phones, you sort of, I add a person into my contacts list, but suddenly the photo is from the Facebook, and it's got Twitter information. It's all sort of intertwined into this like really rich sort of person-centric experience of my people, right? That's because of this mashing of data that's possible.
Is that done by the context provider though?
Content providers help with that because they provide sharing of the data. Yeah. Does this reference need to be a separate thread? It could if you expect it's going to take a while to get back from, because this is a blocking call. So if you think it's going to take more than a couple of seconds, it should be on a separate thread. Typically it doesn't, because as I said, typically you're loading the data from a database, and typically these databases are relatively small because they're just a cached image of something that's in some other larger cloud database, but it depends on an app. Yeah.
Are these two different applications you have to deploy in your UI, or how do you deal with it as common?
They're totally separate. In this particular case, they're separate applications.
But you can have.
Oh yeah, you could have a content provider here, and you can have this guy talk to the content provider. It just content provider needs to make it's used when you want to expose data outside, outside of the world, and that's actually a good point, because as a developer, as an application developer, I find that you rarely care about writing a content provider, okay? Because you're just writing your app. You're actually leveraging other people's content providers, system content providers. You rarely need to expose your data to the rest of the world, unless you're building like a suite of applications or something like that, right? But you typically don't care about exposing the data. So you typically mostly use a content provider rather than provide content provider.
To access data, you don't need a content provider. Within your application, you can just directly access the data.
Yes, exactly. So if you're within the same application, there's really no reason, well, there could, whenever you want to add decoupling, there's a little cost to that. There's a benefit of being flexible to reorganize the components, but if it's your application, your own domain, your own world, there's really maybe no reason for that extra level of abstraction, so it may be easier just to go directly to the database and call it a day. So it just depends. But it is an important component because it lets you tap into the wider set of system available data. So browsers, browser bookmarks, all the media stuff, all the system settings, all your contacts, everything is served by default in the system content providers. All right, so the final component that I have, and then we're done with the components, is a broadcast receiver. So yet another invisible component, can't see it. So broadcast receiver is basically a publish-subscribe mechanism. So it's a piece of code, and you say, okay, I have a piece of code, so that's my receiver, right? And I say, I want to register for a certain system event, i.e. intent, right? You say, I want to register for it. And when that something happens, you get notified, okay? So examples of intents could be the system finished booting up, SMS arrived, battery is running low, network is not available, network is available. All sorts of things like that are broadcasted in the system all the time. The system is a very chatty place, right? So you may say, I want to listen for certain things, and I want to do something when that something happens, right? So it's a publish-subscribe mechanism. So it's different than a service because your code is not running. This piece of code here is dormant. It's just sitting here doing nothing, not even in memory. It just simply told somebody to get a phone call when something happens. And it only gets woken up, triggered, when that event, intent, happens. Make sense? So that's basically what the broadcast receiver is. Yes, you can also broadcast your own intents. Yes, so you can just broadcast your intents as much as you want. Yeah. So let me show you now that we kind of looked at activities, intents, services, content providers, broadcast receivers. let me show you how that Yamba application would sort of come together using these Lego blocks that we have available to us. So, you know, this is what I wrote in my book. These are the chapters 6 through 12 or something. So it's step by step. So that's what it mirrors. And by the way, I keep mentioning the book. It's coming out this month. But if you want a free draft version, so that's going to be available later on this month. If you want a free version, I don't know how long it's going to be available. And again, this is just a draft. It's learning-android.com, and that's going to forward you to some URL that's much harder to remember than this one. It looks like this. So your choice, which one you prefer. But it's basically the entire book before it got published. This was the O'Reilly's open feedback thing. So what we are talking about, we've talked about like chapter 2, 4, and now we're starting about. I'm explaining chapter 5 essentially, and then we're gonna get to chapter 6 sort of. So that's roughly what it mirrors. If you're looking for additional information, just so you know. So let me show you. So first of all, why did I pick this application? So when I was looking for, I love example-based learning, right? Like you're building something and that's how you learn. Yeah, your question? Yes. So broadcast receiver is yet another component, and just like anything else, it's a topping on top of a pizza. So as long as if you don't have an application, it needs to start up the Linux process, needs to load up Dalvik on top of it, needs to load up the broadcast receiver, execute the code, and then dismantle if it's not needed anymore. Everything by default happens on one single thread. Yes. So this runs on the same thread as your UI and everything else. And you have about, I think, 10 seconds to process it before ANR. Yeah. So back to Yamba. So basically, the couple of reasons for this application is that it's something everyone can get what a Twitter app is. So I don't have to explain too much the features and so on. But the main reason why I picked this as a sample is because there's a natural way of organically growing it. So we're doing small steps at a time, right? And it's always whole and complete. So in other words, I can do a little bit, show you how it works, and it's whole and complete. It doesn't do a lot, but it works, right? So it can naturally grow. And it's also an application that, in a sort of a natural way, touches on all these different components. I used to have different apps. I used to have like a Sudoku game and a golf cart app, and they tend to be more focused on just one aspect of Android. This one is sort of very comprehensive, so that's why I kind of like it as an example app. Not that I use Twitter or anything like that much. So the part 1 of this is what we're going to do today. We're going to basically build a activity. So we're going to build a UI. So this is a part of one activity, one screen. So we're going to talk a little bit about UI because that tends to be one of the things that you guys get most stuck on. And then we're going to post to process the event, and we're going to post that to the cloud, and we're going to verify that works. So and by the way, I got the network connection going, so I can back to Yamba just to kind of show you what they have in mind. This is essentially what we're going to build. So that website that I told you I couldn't access, well, there it is. So yamba.maracana.com. There's last post was 10 hours ago, I believe. Yeah. So if I go here and I say student, let me just double check that this is password. Oops. Okay, and that that we are pointing to that API. Okay, so if I go back to status update, hello from AnDevCon update. So this is posting. It's attempting now to it says it failed. Yeah. I tried, but that's yeah. We're gonna look at also. We're gonna debug this white field. So it's as a part of this application. Actually, it's meant to fail a couple of times, but then we're supposed to learn about the tools, the debugging tools, and then fix that. So we're gonna look into that. So that's the first part of that. So in this picture, I only have one activity. Super simple. Next, what I do is I add another activity, because the reason why this is not sufficient is because so far in this activity I would hard code my username and password, so it's not very useful. So I need to provide a way for user to change username and password. It's a good reason to have another activity, but this also introduces a whole bunch of stuff. It basically requires us to have a way to go between the activities. It also we use intents, right, to jump back and forth. We also learn about the file system and how to share the data between the two activities. So there's something called share preferences and how the context is shared between these two components. Okay, so that's part two. Part three is we now have a way to post the data to Twitter, right? But now we want to have a way to pull the data from Twitter. So what I proposed in my design was to basically have something that works in a background, a service that's always on, always running, and periodically goes and says, do you have new tweets? If you do, pull it down, right? So basically, every so often, wakes up, goes online, pulls down the tweets, right? So that's a service. That also introduces a concept of application, because in this point, we are replicating some code. For example, how to connect to Twitter, we need it here, but we also need it here. That sounds like copy-pasting of code, not a good idea, right? So for that purpose, we introduce a concept of an application object. So it's something that actually is very useful because you can share things for the entire application. So these components are loosely coupled, but they also live inside of the same context, which gives them some privileges, right? So that's part three. Part four, what we now do is once we have the data in here, we need to do something with that data, so we introduce the database. So we actually learn how to work with databases. Okay. Part four, we now finally can display that data. So we can actually show what people are doing, what our friends are doing by creating yet another activity. So we have an application with 3 activities, a service, and a database at this point. So it's got a couple of moving parts, right? We also, in this case, introduce a base activity to share some of the common functionality. We also leverage the application again to share some of the things that are common to the entire application. And then we add a little more complexity to it by saying, well, you know what? Wouldn't it be nice if this update service that needs to be always on, always running was actually started at boot, right? Automatically, so that I don't have to worry as a user to go and say, oh, I need to start this and start that. That'd be kind of annoying and useless, right? So we introduce a boot receiver, which basically is registered for notifications when the system is booted and it starts stop a service, right? So this is one line of code, essentially. Just bam, starts a service. It's not that complex. I also say, well, what about if the network becomes unavailable? For example, I'm flying, right? I'm going across the country. Well, I'm not going to have network connection for 4 or 5 hours, so it'd be pointless to keep on trying to fire up the radio and waste the battery if the network is not available. That's if you haven't turned off your phone, of course. But wouldn't it be nice if we just said, hey, when the system knows when the network is down. When the network is down, tell us, so we'll turn off updates, right? And then when the network is available, we're automatically going to turn back on the updates. Right, so that's what the network receiver in this case do. And then there's also a receiver here that has a purpose just in the context of timeline activity. So that's another example of that. So at this point we have quite a bit of stuff going on. And ultimately what I wanted to do is I wanted to introduce content providers into this big picture, but I didn't really have a need for it because like I said earlier, you usually use content provider, you don't necessarily provide content provider. So if I'm using a content provider, there's no real reason to use it within my own application since it's much easier just to go directly to the database, right? That's our database. So why would they need a content provider? Sounds like extra, work for nothing. So I was kind of thinking of what to do about that, and I came up with a good reason to need a content provider, and that's if I want to have a widget, an app widget, meaning something for a home screen. I'm talking about the little widgets you put on a home screen. Well, that's actually a different, running in a different app process altogether, right? That runs in a different process, in a home screen process. So for that to access data, you need to expose that data. So here's another natural yet logical reason to actually use a content provider, right? So that's why we now introduce a content provider, which in this case just uses the data from the database and it shares that data with a widget. So that's kind of how the progression of this app, right? And the goal of this was more to kind of explain, architecture of an application, right? So, given those main building blocks, this is how you may put together an application, right? Does that kind of make sense at the level of lines and circles? Right? I mean, we can, I can show you a little now. If that, if that is clear, I can kind of show you a little bit of, what the code may look like, right? But once you understand the lines and circles, the code it's not that complex, right? At the end of the day, it's just Java code, right? So just to kind of for example, so this is Yamba. So remember that manifest file. Well, here's the manifest file for that application. So manifest file is not really going to explode beyond a couple of pages, for a medium-sized app. It's it's a place you declare your main building blocks. And as you can see, I'm saying we have so this is my application, Yamba, right? We're saying I got one activity called timeline activity. The fact that you don't need to worry about what these lines say, but whoever has these lines is going to be the home page, the entry point into the app, right? So if I move this from one activity to another, it would make that activity be the entry point. Make sense? It's kind of like, think of it as a little token. Whoever you give it to, that's the entry point. So I'm saying here's another activity, status activity, here's another activity, preference activity, here's my updater service, the one that cranks in the background. This is my boot receiver, and it's registered to receive on boot complete, right? So as you guys can see, it's just a little bit of XML code. It's not really that big of a deal. And that's basically my application, and then I'm also specifying a couple of permissions here. I'm saying I need a permission for internet and to know when the system is booted and to write to external storage and that sort of stuff, right? That make sense? So that's what the manifest file would look like. And now, if I look at the Java code, for instance, remember that boot receiver it's gonna get notified here. It's gonna say boot receiver. So when we get boot completed, this is how we're subscribing for boot completed notification, right? So when the boot completed happens, this guy gets woken up. So how does it get woken up? Well, it looks like this. I mean, it's really, you almost don't even need this. Really, the only line of code that is important here is this. But basically, there's again a callback method. It's not on create, but it's on receive. So all these main building blocks, sort of, almost don't worry about too much about the intricacies of the code. It's like there's certain patterns that repeat themselves. So remember, to write an activity, you start by subclassing an activity. To write a content boot receiver, broadcast receiver, you extend the system receiver, right? And then you implement on receive. Okay. Same for service. To create a service, you extend system service and then you fill in the blanks, right? So in this case, this is the blanks that we're filling in, right? It doesn't really matter what the details are, but essentially all it says is, start a service in case that we need to start a service. Yeah.
I noticed you're not calling super on this instance.
Yeah.
Does that mean that the super on receive doesn't really do anything?
Yeah, so the super of onReceive is not needed. In services and activities, you must call super, but in receivers and providers, you don't need to call super. And it kind of has to do with, see, there's something called the app context, so which is basically the context of your entire application. So this is my entire application. This is my pizza, and everything else is a topping, right? So this is my app context. To get every component can get a handle of the context quite easily. And as a matter of fact, activities and services are context. In other words, they're subclasses of it, right? So they inherit everything. But providers and receivers, they don't, but they have it readily available. So it's a ISA as opposed to it's a HAZA as opposed to ISA. Yeah. So something is going to send, the system is going to broadcast boot completed, and this guy, because it's registered, it's going to get that notification. Something is going to broadcast network up, network down, and this guy is going to get a notification for that reason. So basically, what happens is notification is an intent. So an intent gets broadcasted. There's something that then handles that intent, right? So something basically takes that intent. It says, oh, here's an intent that says boot is completed, right? And it handles it by saying, okay, who do we need to notify that boot is completed? So there's a short list of people, right? One of them is our own boot receiver. There could be other people who are not in components that are interested in that. So we're on that list. So it says, okay, we're going to call the receiver. The way you call a receiver is by calling its onReceive method. So the only entry point into a receiver is onReceive.
So a notification is an intent?
Yes. So there's no such thing as a notification. If you're thinking about a notification with a capital N, that is just basically, that's a UI component. That's more of a this kind of thing. That's what goes into the drawer. There's a notification that goes into this drawer, but that is a different thing. It's not related to this. Yeah. That is just a sort of a UI thingy that pops something up into that drawer. Is an application and process the same thing? Well, they're not the same thing, but you need a process in which the application is running, right? So there's application with the capital A, right? There's an object called application, so that gives you certain certain capabilities, and that's something that every component in your app has access to. So that in this case, I have the context, but I also have an application object which is readily available to everyone. So I use this to hang off of any data that I may want to share, like shared components. But all this is running inside of the same process, right? The same Linux process. You could have multiple applications running inside of the same Linux process. So it's not necessarily one-to-one relationship. It's rare, but it's possible. They would have to use a shared context. Yeah. What are they? It should have been. It should have been. It should have been this HTTP yamba.maracana.com/API. So that's where the API is for it. So yeah, we'll figure out what's going on with this. Sometimes when I'm behind the proxy, the emulator needs a special settings, but I don't know if that's the case in this case. We'll find out. I'm not too concerned about it. Any other questions on sort of the design of an app, what that looks like? It's a lot of lines and circles, huh? Gets busy. Okay, so with that, let's talk a little bit about user interface and kind of discuss certain things there, because that's one aspect of just like I showed you guys like in the code, like you know, this is plain old Java, so you would understand a lot of things here. Yes, there's certain Android APIs that you can tap into, but a lot of this stuff is a plain old Java. Like for example, if I'm starting a service, update or service, right? You know, a lot of these things are just like, for example, here, this is my thread that's running the updates. Well, this is more or less plain old Java, right? So I'm not too concerned about those things. Once you understand how they fit together, it becomes like, okay, just here's your placeholder, fill in the blanks type of thing. But UI is one thing that we took sort of a departure from standard Java by yanking out AWT and Swing and replacing it with something else. So that's kind of what I want to talk about next. So, so to do that, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to actually I'm going to create a new Yamba application so that I have a place to actually show you all this stuff. So I'm going to do file, new Android project. I'll say Yamba demo, for example. I'm going to pick an API target, for example, 2.2, doesn't really matter. And then I'm going to say application is Yamba demo. Package name, Markana demo, for example. Activity, I'll start with this. So basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to start this first part here, which is creating this status activity. This is the piece of screen where you type in something, you say hello from, click on update, post to your Twitter account. That's what we're going to do, right? It's whole and complete, it's self-contained, it's small enough and manageable. And we can see it working by logging into the website. So I'm going to start by creating with that activity. So here's my activity, status activity. Minimum SDK version doesn't really matter. Okay. So that creates a new project here altogether. So that's my new project. We're back at hello world, right? So what we have so far is hello world. Now, so now we have a placeholder to do something. So let me start by talking about a little bit about UI, so you can kind of see what we're doing here. So there are a couple of ways of doing UI in Android. There are basically two ways. One way is to do it declaratively. So you can declare your UI in something like XML, right? So you write XML code. The other way is to write procedurally. So in other words, you are writing Java, right? And it's very similar to writing AWT or Swing code. Okay? Similar constructs, maybe different API. So the best practice is to basically start here, start with XML, get it as far as you possibly can, right? And then that's at some point switch over to Java, right? So XML tends to be a really good way to describe your UI, right? Java tends to be a really good way to attach business logic to your UI. To say, so here you say what the UI looks like. Here you say what the UI does. Okay, does that make sense? So we're going to start, and this is pretty common. We're going to start with the XML. So I'm going to open up that page, that resource, which is layout main. In this case, you may want to rename main to something else. As a matter of fact, let me do this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to rename, just to demonstrate something. I'm going to rename this file to something else, such as status, because main is kind of doesn't really tell me the story, right? It's a status layout for my status activity screen. So I'm going to change the name. So in Eclipse, you don't have a rename, you have a refactor rename, and that's supposed to do, as you know, intelligently rename all the references and all that. So I'm going to change this simply from main XML to status XML. But it just broke everything, right? So certain things that you expect to do, if you use Eclipse for Java development and you expect certain things to work a certain way, it may disappoint you at some point in time. So in this case, what happened is, remember how I said this file R, right, is automatically created whenever anything in resources changes, right? And then this guy is using R to get to this, right? So since we changed this, R automatically changed, but this did not. Okay, so that's why now this is broken. So, and more specifically, our reference to R layout main no longer exists because it's a new R with the new, it got compiled and so forth. So you would do dot, but at least Eclipse knows what's available, so you just fix it quickly to status. Oops. And save it. Keep saving your files. That's a very important thing. I don't need to move a car. So that's basically that's going to be our activity. But we're going to leave Java second. I'm going to focus on this first. Okay. So this is my little screen, and some of you said, and by the way, this is also new, but see how the widgets that I have here are different depending on a version of tools that I set here. So if I roll back to 3, 2, 1, I'm going to have a slightly different look and feel. So keep that in mind because they changed the widgets both in Gingerbread and in Honeycomb. So they look different, okay? Another thing that you can configure here is you can configure the size of the screen. So say, for example, the big black box that I have here is now for portrait mode. I can say landscape mode. And that's supposed to switch this to landscape, but it's not. Oh. Yeah, that's fine. And also here I'm supposed to be able to change the size of a screen for this.
You're still on main.xml because you renamed it.
Oh, I see. It's not. Got it. Okay. So thank you. That's. I was under the impression that there we go. So I could basically change this and so on and make this appear as if it's a specific device. Now. I don't really care about this too much because the way we're gonna do UI is that we're totally agnostic to the actual devices, right? And that's how you should think about UI. That's when people talk about the fragmentation of Android, it means different things to different people. But one of the things is that we have so many different devices in terms of their capabilities. So they have different screen sizes, screen shapes, screen densities, etc. Right? So I want to build an app that's going to look great on tiny little, HTC Tattoo maybe, and as well it's going to look great on my Google TV at home, right? So you want to basically, it's going to scale up and down proper. That's our goal. That's how we want to design things. So that way we don't really care what it's getting deployed on. It's going to look good. So usually when I work on a UI, I like to set things up sort of that I open up my properties window here, and I also open up my my outline here on the show view, and I like to have my outline here as well, and I usually lay them out like this so that I have these two things. So we'll get to that. And another thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to change the theme here to theme light so that it's black on white as opposed to white on black. The reason why I'm doing this is for you guys in the back, you can see this much better, right? Because of the contrast of the projector. This is not going to reflect in the running code yet. There's another change that I need to do for the running application. But at least for the development, it helps us for now, right? If I want to actually make this change in the running code, I actually have to do it here. And don't worry about what it is right now because style theme light. So Android style theme light. So that should now reflect it in a running application. So I update that in a manifest file. Don't worry about that too much, but that's basically I'm applying a theme or a style sheet to my entire app. And the only reason why I'm doing this is because of the projector issues with the contrast. Okay, so let's do this step by step. So we're gonna we want to build a UI that, let me change this to look like this, and let me roll back one screen. So once in a while it doesn't rotate properly. That's the emulator. Never mind. So let's just keep it like this. This is the UI that I want to build. So how many components, which components do you see on the screen? And how many components do you see on the screen? You can see the outline. So we see the mother of all. We see the big box that represents our application, right? So that is one component. Okay. What else do you see? The button. We see the button. Okay. So there's a button there. Okay. We see so there's a label here, piece of text. Excuse my scribing here. And we see another component here, which is where we enter text, right? So we see 1, 2, 3, 4 components in total, right? This is not the world's simplest UI, but it's very close to the world's simplest UI, right? So it's very, very minimalistic. So we want to build this. So I usually lay this out in stages. First, I throw all the components into my screen. Then, so that's pass 1. Pass 2 is adjust their size. Pass 3 is adjust their properties, and so on. So I kind of do this in like multiple passes through the UI. So what we're going to do is, in here, I'm going to go and I'm going to find these widgets. And there are a gazillion widgets here, right? So as you can see, I already have the layout, the mother of all, right? That's this big box here. Okay, but I don't have the piece of text, which is also known as the text view, which is, did I miss it? Yeah. Well, I do have a piece of text. It's right here. Well, we can keep that as a piece of text. So the next thing that I would need is the edit text, which is the text that you can edit. So I'm going to drop that in here. So that's my second component. And then the third component that I have is a button. So I'm going to just drag it and I'm going to drop it here. So you can kind of verify here in the outline that you do have 4 components. I have the mother of all, and then it's got 3 things inside of it, right? Make sense? So for those of you who have experience with AWT and Swing, this sort of corresponds to the, so this is sort of the hierarchy, corresponds to the containers and components. It's the very same model, right? So layouts are what we would, in Java we would call containers, but containers are components. So it's a composite pattern, right? And then anything in Java that you can put anywhere on the screen is a component. And in Android, we call them widgets or views, okay? But widgets not to be confused with the widgets that go into the home screen. Nothing in common, right? So it's a totally separate thing. So they're technically widgets, but they're also all called views. So you know that's why it's edit view, text view, except it's not button view. It's just button, and it's not edit text. Well, it's actually not edit view. It's edit text. So there's some inconsistency in terms of naming, right? For those components. But that's what a view is. It's basically a component. So you can verify here that I have, you know, the mother of all and 3 kids inside of it. Now, if I want to adjust one of these, so first thing that every single component, if you select it and click on properties, you're going to have gazillion properties here. Okay. And Eclipse, by the way, it happens to be probably better documentation than anything else for what property does, right? So, for example, if you put a mouse over a specific property, it tells you what property is. Now, out of all these things, there are certain properties that are more important than others. And for some reason that slide is not here, so let me just pick it up from, so let me, hold on a second. Yeah, let me see. I have a slide that basically tells you what those properties are, and let me see where it is, just for a second. All right, here we go. So these are sort of the more important properties. And I'll add these slides. I don't know why they went missing. There are only 2 slides that are missing. But basically, the 2 properties that you universally always care about are layout width and layout height. That's it. How wide and how tall your widget is, right? You always need to specify this, okay? So let's take a look at that. So for the button, those 2 properties would be at the bottom, right? So, yeah, they're under MISC, and sometimes it's hidden here, so be mindful of that. So MISC may be collapsed, so you might want to open it up. But they're right here. And layout width and layout height are basically the height and width. So for example, for width, if I wanted this to stretch all the way, I could specify something like 200 pixels. That's kind of off. So let's do 300 pixels. And that's still off. So at some point you would get it right, but this is not the right way of doing it. There are a couple of reasons for that. So let me first of all talk about units. So these are the units that we have in Android. Pixels, you guys know pixels, inches, some of you know millimeters, points. So these are the new units that we have in Android, okay? DP and DIP is basically the same unit, and it stands for density independent pixel. So it's basically a pixel that at 160 dpi, 1 pixel equals 1 dp. So in other words, don't use px ever again. Just use dp, and you're good. There's absolutely no reason to use pixels again, right? Because they're useless since the screen resolution, not resolution, but density changes. So just replace px with dp, and you're good to go. Can you get artifacts if you're doing stuff that's based on pixel alignment? I would do it based on, well, yeah, you could, because there's a rounding, right? Possibly. There's a potential rounding errors. So you could get a tiny little, 1 pixel off depending on the rounding. But you could also do everything based on DP if you're doing absolute stuff.
Can you do that relative to the screen size?
Can you do it relative to screen size? Yes, we'll do that. But we're going to do that using width and height, fill parent wrap content. Yeah. SP is like DP, but it's only used for scalable fonts. So if you want the font that actually adjusts the size compared to user choice. So for example, I may say let that font be 30 dp, but if user wants to scale it up because user can't see, user can say I want everything extra large. So 30 dp, 30 SP may actually translate into 45 dp or something, right? So in other words, one better here would be to, as opposed to 300 dpx, I use dp, okay? But that's still not smart enough because now it's not going to scale. If I run this app on my Google TV, it's going to be a tiny little button in the top left corner, right? And I have a big screen TV, right? So not what you want. So what you want to use for layout width and layout height is one of these 2 things. I say 2, but there you can see 3. So basically there's fill parent, match parent, and wrap content. So fill parent, match parent is the same thing. Match parent is the new version of fill parent. So that's what it is. But basically what they're saying, what these statements are saying is wrap content says make the button as wide as it takes to wrap its own content. In other words, the button is going to take as much space as it needs to wrap its own internal internal content here, okay? Plus, some some padding and all that stuff, but that's not that important right now. Okay, so that's one possible option. The second possible option is to specify fill parent or match parent, again, same thing, which says take all the available space, right? So it's taking all the available space that's on this. So this is now going to scale properly. Like, for example, if let me rotate my screen. So I'm going to go from portrait to landscape and see how the button again filled the entire screen, right? Make sense? So I got my button right. I mean, I could do the same thing for height, wrap content, or fill parent. Bam! Now I have a gigantic button, right? So you guys get that? Those two properties, fill parent, wrap content. That's what you wanna exclusively use those two pretty much for all your width and height. And width and height is what you always universally care about. Okay?
Do these options change based on the type of layout we use?
They do not change, no. The new version of the Android developer tools actually has these little buttons here, so you can kind of press this and kind of do that. Okay, but again, the tools are nice, but if you start doing anything tiny bit more sophisticated, you run into limitations of these tools. So that's why I'd rather you guys understand the XML, right? It's kind of like teaching you HTML. Yes, you can build a website using Dreamweaver, but you can't really do anything serious with Dreamweaver, right? So at some point you got to understand the XML or the HTML in that case, right? So that's why, I'm kind of using maybe the longer approach here. All right, so let's look at the next component. The next component is this guy here. So how much space do we want? So it's already fill parent for width, right? So how much space do we want for height? So my choices are fill parent, match parent, match parent, or wrap content. So right now it's tiny. I would like it to be big. So what do I choose? Fill parent or match parent, right? Bam. So here's what happens. So what happened? What happened to my button? The button's gone, right? So the button is actually at this point here below. It got pushed out, right? It's still there, but you can't see it. It got pushed out. So here's what happens. So we're using a layout. Unlike Java, in Java you had a container and then you applied a manager on top of that container, right? And that manager had a policy how to lay components. In Android, container and manager are one, right? So you just have a layout. A layout is both a container and it also has a certain policy to it. So in this particular case, we're using something called the layout, linear layout, which looks like this. So basically, it either lays components next to each other. So that would be, 1, 2, 3, 4. So in other words, left to right or top to bottom. 1, 2, 3, 4. It's pretty straightforward. One of the simplest layout managers, right? So that's a linear layout. So in this case, I have a linear layout, and I'm saying lay out these 3 children, right? So linear layout says, okay, text, how much space do you need? Let's talk about height-wise only, right? So it says wrap content. All right, wrap content, that much real estate gone. Comes to a second child and says, how much space do you need? And this guy says, I want to take all the available space, right? So this child basically took all the available space from the parent, right? So by the time the third kid comes along, there's no more space left, right? Kind of sucks being the youngest kid. I knew that. So that's what happens. So in other words, order matters in this case. So what do we do, right? How do we fix that? I mean, I could now say, well, what about going into pixels and DPs and all that? But that's really not a good solution. That's a hack, right? So the good solution is to basically use a third property that we have here on the list of important properties, which is called layout weight. And layout weight is sort of the easiest way to explain it is you're saying how greedy you are as a component. So 0 means I don't care about anyone else's needs. 1 means I'm totally yielding to everyone else, right? And it could be anywhere in the middle. So that's kind of how you can have components fight for space. One can say 60%, one can take 60%, the other one 40%, and so on, right? So you can be flexible and dynamic at the same time, right? So it's kind of like setting up the springs on components. So in this case, what I can do for this edit text is I can say layout weight 1, meaning adhere to anyone else's needs. So we're still saying, daddy, daddy, I want all the space, right? But we're also saying we're going to be mindful of younger children as well, younger siblings as well, right? And there now we have a UI that is reasonably good representation of what we wanted to accomplish. So piece of text, big box, button at the bottom, right? So it's pretty standard. So there's piece of text, big box, button at the bottom. Yeah. No, it doesn't have to. Like for example, if the button also said fill parent, so for height it said fill parent, but it said so now button pushed out the previous kid, right? But now it says 1. Now they're 50-50, right? Now if button says, yeah, I adhere to others, but I'm a little more greedy than others, now button is actually squeezing the other guy out. So it's got weight of half, and this has a weight of 1. So this one is yielding more than this guy. So it's kind of inversely proportional to percentage that it takes, because you're specifying a yield as opposed to essentially how much you're taking. So that's sort of how that works.
So
yeah, go ahead.
it'll only accept numbers between 0 and 1.
Yes, it can only be a number between 0 and 1. Yeah, integers are overloaded in Android. So that's another thing we'll talk about. In the world of Java, everything is an object, right? In the world of Android, a lot of objects are just basically ints. So an integer means many different things. So type safety is sort of broken, right? In exchange for speed, I presume. So we'll talk about that. So now that we have that reasonably well laid out, another thing that I want to mention is gravity and layout gravity. So I want to center this piece of text, okay? So the word for alignment is gravity. Now, if you look through these gazillion properties, you're going to find 2 gravities. You're going to find layout gravity and gravity. They do different things. So layout gravity specifies how to lay out this box, okay, within its parent, okay? So if I want to lay it out, center it, laying out this box within its parent, it's not really going to do much centering it because it's already so big that moving it to a center you can't see it, right? There's no margin, right? Versus gravity, which basically says how to lay out the content of the box within the box itself, which is what we want, right? So that's in other words, if one doesn't work, use the other one, right? But they do different things. So in this case, it's gravity, and you can just click on center, for example, and that's going to center it. So that's my piece of text here, right? And so now we have that looking reasonably good. Okay. So now the third pass that I want to do is I want to fix the text. I want to change all this text. I don't like this hello world, hello status activity business there, right? I mean, I want to say update status or something. So, one of the properties that's important is a property called text. So I can go find it, right? And I can change it. I can say update status. Right? Great, that worked. But this is not the right way to do it. So this will work. It will work only when it comes to. It will work to a certain extent. because it's not certain places are enforcing that you do these things properly. So you might as well start doing them properly from the get-go. The proper way to do it is just like we separated Java from resources, okay? We also want to separate resources from resources. So in other words, specific resources are separate from other resources. So this resource that I'm working on, status, is a layout, right? It lives in layouts folder. And it is concerned with the layout of a screen. That's it. That's its job. That's its only concern. So it's not concerned with text. So what we should do in this case is we should actually refer to a piece of text in the text area, which is strings XML, right? So the proper way of doing it would be to refer to that, and the way we do that is by saying, so where's my text property? So for text, you would say at string slash. So at string means go look at the strings XML. This is how you refer to an XML file from XML file as opposed to from Java. Remember, from Java we used r dot to refer, right? The R class. But from XML we don't. We use at string slash and then the name of that particular string. So I could, for example, open up my strings XML and see what's available, and there's something called app name, and it already has the value Yamba demo. In other words, it looks like that, right? App name, Yamba demo. So I could now go here and I could click on this, and I could say add string slash app underscore name, bam, Yamba demo. And it's misspelled and all that, right? So I can go here, I can now fix this, Yamba, hit save, remember important, and now that reflects here as well, right? So this is one way of doing it, and you can see how as you're doing a lot of these pieces of text, this can really quickly get really annoying if you had to do this in every single piece of text. So Eclipse actually provides some useful shortcuts here. So, for example, if I wanted to create a new piece of text, yes, I could go here and create it and then refer to it and type it and hope for no typos and so on. Or I can actually use the little dot button, which, by the way, still doesn't work in Ubuntu and some other platforms for some reason. You can click on new string. You can quickly specify, you get this create new Android string property. I can specify the string name. So, for example, this would be title update status, right? And I'll say update status. So that's my piece of text, right? I'll explain this stuff later on. And that injects a new string into strings XML. It's right there. And now I just pick it, and that is added, and it's referred to properly. So the dot, there's a little dot button. I think it's a shortcut for browse or something, right? So that way you do not have to have this file open again, strings XML, right? It just Eclipse adjusts it magically. Yeah.
How do you account for locale?
So how do we account for locale? That's a great question, and we should. Let me show you then that, and then we're gonna do lunch. So the purpose of separating strings from layouts is that you can have multiple competing sets of resources. In other words, you don't have to have one layout for this screen. You can have 5 or 10, right? Depending on what kind of screen you want to target. You also don't have to have one set of text. You can have multiple sets of text for multiple languages. So let's say, for example, I wanted to create a version of my application for a different language. So I would create a new XML file. Now Eclipse provides a useful tool called new Android XML file. And it comes up with this dialog box. And it knows that it's a Yamba demo, and it knows it's a strings XML. And it says, well, this file already exists. But what I can do now is I can say I want to specify one of the qualifiers. And these are the various things you can qualify your resources based on, right? And not all of them make sense in all situations, right? For text, language does make sense. So I'm going to say language is one of the qualifiers. And then you enter the two-letter ISO code of the language you're targeting. So say, for example, I'm targeting French, right? So I do FR. And notice what happened. All that happens is Eclipse creates a new folder called values-fr instead of just values that we currently have. Currently we have resources values. It's proposing to create a new folder, resources values fr, right? If I add more stuff, like for example, I say, how about I wanna, it's not just French, but I want French for Canada, because you know they speak differently there than in France, right? So right now, notice that the directory is now values-fr-rca, right? And you can go crazy with this. You can say, I want to specify what happens in a night mode on a specific pixel density, touch screen, keyboard available, not available, yada yada. But it may not make sense for strings. For strings, this does make sense, right? But you can also create alternative resources for screens, right? A common one would be, I want to provide the layout for landscape mode, or I want to provide the layout for Google TV, and so on. Okay? So that's how you would do that. And then the system, based on the current configuration, would figure out what the best fit is, right? And if it's not available, it would go to the default version. Yeah. Yeah. So the question is, do you have to provide all the copies of the strings? No, you don't. So basically, it says, oh, I noticed that the user is in French Canada. Let's see if it's available. If it's not, it's going to go to the default. But if I was in France, it wouldn't even use the French Canada. It would just use the default. So in other words, it tries to find the best match. Yeah. All right, so let's do, I know it's noon. I know you guys want to get your lunch before everyone else. So let's do, I think it's 1:30 is when we start again, right? Okay, and then we're going to continue with this. So this is, the fun stuff is just starting up, so.